Hoy vamos a desenterrar una de las historias más crueles y humillantes que la realeza europea ha presenciado. No es una leyenda. Es la historia real de cómo una reina, símbolo del poder absoluto, fue arrastrada por el lodo de la revolución hasta su trágico final. Esta es la historia de María Antonieta, pero no la que te contaron en los libros. Imaginen por un momento una joven archiduquesa de Austria, enviada a Francia para casarse y asegurar la paz, se convierte en reina de una de las naciones más poderosas del mundo. Lujo, fiestas, extravagancia, todo parecía un cuento de hadas, pero fuera de los muros dorados de Versalles, el pueblo francés moría de hambre y la rabia comenzaba a hervir. La frase "que coman pastel", aunque probablemente nunca la dijo, se convirtió en el grito de guerra contra ella. Para los revolucionarios, María Antonieta no era solo una reina extranjera, era el símbolo de todo lo que estaba mal con la monarquía francesa. La apodaron Madame Déficit, culpándola de la bancarrota del país mientras ellos sufrían. La propaganda la pintaba como una mujer depravada, una traidora que conspiraba contra el pueblo que debía proteger. Cuando la Revolución Francesa estalló, el cuento de hadas se transformó en una pesadilla. La familia real intentó huir, pero fueron capturados. Este fue el punto de no retorno. La humillación pública comenzó. Encerrada en la prisión del Temple, María Antonieta fue despojada de su título, de sus lujos, y lo más doloroso, de sus hijos. Imaginen el terror de una madre al ver cómo le arrebatan a su pequeño, Luis Carlos, para adoctrinarlo en contra de ella. El juicio fue una farsa. La justicia revolucionaria no buscaba la verdad, sino una cabeza para la guillotina. La acusaron de todo, desde conspirar con potencias extranjeras hasta los cargos más viles e infundados que una madre puede enfrentar. Su dignidad durante el juicio fue lo único que le quedaba. Frente a acusaciones monstruosas, respondió con una fuerza que silenció a la multitud por un momento, pero la sentencia ya estaba escrita. El 16 de octubre de 1793, el día de su ejecución, la historia alcanzó su punto más oscuro. No la llevaron en un carruaje cerrado, como a su esposo, el rey. A ella la subieron a una carreta abierta, exponiéndola a los insultos y escupitajos de la misma gente que una vez la aclamó. Su cabello, antes famoso por sus elaborados peinados, había encanecido por el estrés, y se lo habían cortado bruscamente. Sus manos estaban atadas a la espalda. Este no era solo un castigo, era una humillación calculada, un espectáculo de poder y violencia para el pueblo. Al subir al cadalso, dicen que pisó sin querer al verdugo, y sus últimas palabras fueron: disculpe, señor, no lo hice a propósito. Incluso en sus últimos momentos, conservó una pizca de la etiqueta de la corte que una vez conoció. Segundos después, la hoja de la guillotina cayó, sellando el fin de una era y convirtiendo a María Antonieta en una de las reinas más trágicas de la historia. Su historia nos muestra el lado más sangriento del poder, la facilidad con la que una figura puede ser demonizada y cómo la justicia puede convertirse en venganza. Esta es la historia que no siempre se enseña. La cara humana detrás del mito. La caída brutal de una reina que pagó el precio de un sistema corrupto y un pueblo enfurecido. Gracias por acompañarme en este viaje al pasado oscuro. Ever wonder why old paintings and stories from medieval England seem so full of drama and, let's be honest, a bit grim? A big part of that has to do with how they handled justice. Forget private trials and quiet prison sentences. In medieval England, punishment was a public spectacle, a full-blown show for everyone to see. It wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was about sending a powerful, terrifying message to the entire community. Imagine this. You're walking through the town square, and instead of a farmer's market, a massive crowd is gathered. There's a buzz in the air, a mix of excitement, dread, and morbid curiosity. At the center of it all, a wooden scaffold stands tall against the sky. This wasn't a rare event. It was a scheduled part of life. Executions, floggings, and time in the stocks were all public performances, carefully staged to have the maximum psychological impact. Why go to all this trouble? The answer is simple. Control. Medieval rulers, kings, lords, and church officials needed to maintain order. With no modern police force or constant surveillance, they relied on a much more potent tool, fear. By making punishments as public and brutal as possible, they demonstrated the absolute power of the law and the dire consequences of stepping out of line. The message was crystal clear. This could be you. Let's talk about the different kinds of public punishment. The most extreme, of course, was execution. Hanging was common for crimes like theft or poaching. The gallows were often built at a crossroads or on a hill just outside of town, so travelers would see the bodies, sometimes left hanging for days, as a gruesome welcome sign. It was a constant, rotting reminder of the king's justice. For more serious crimes like treason, the punishment was even more horrific. Being hanged, drawn, and quartered was a fate designed to utterly destroy the body and serve as the ultimate warning against defying the crown. But it wasn't all about death. The stocks and the pillory were also hugely popular. These wooden contraptions would trap a person's head, hands, or feet, leaving them helpless in the middle of the town square. Their crime would be written on a sign for all to see. 4 hours, sometimes days, they would be subjected to public ridicule. People would throw rotten vegetables, animal dung, and whatever else they could find. It was entertainment for the crowd, but utter humiliation for the victim. The goal wasn't just physical discomfort, it was social death. You would be shamed in front of your neighbors, your friends, your family. That kind of social pressure was a powerful way to enforce conformity. Even the journey to the place of punishment was part of the ritual. A condemned prisoner would be paraded through the streets. Sometimes they were tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame, and dragged over the rough, filthy roads. This procession, known as the Via Dolorosa or Sorrowful Way, gave everyone a chance to see the condemned and reflect on their crimes. Priests might walk alongside, urging them to confess and save their soul, adding a layer of religious authority to the state's power. These events drew huge crowds. It was a day out for many. Vendors would sell food and drinks, creating a bizarre, festival-like atmosphere. Parents would bring their children, teaching them a harsh lesson about right and wrong. For the authorities, a large turnout was a success. The more people who witnessed the power of the law firsthand, the more effective the deterrent would be. Fear was the invisible force that kept the social order intact. So, the next time you think about medieval England, remember that the town square wasn't just for markets and festivals. It was a theater of justice, where the drama of crime and punishment played out for all to see. It was a brutal, effective system that used public spectacle to control a population, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon a ruler can have is the fear in people. Ever wondered what would happen if you were accused of a crime you didn't commit? Today, you'd get a lawyer, there'd be evidence, and you'd have your day in court. We take these things for granted, but our idea of justice is a very modern invention. For most of human history, getting a fair trial was, well, basically impossible. Let's take a trip back in time to see just how different and, frankly, terrifying the concept of justice used to be. Imagine living in a world where a simple rumor could ruin your life. No need for hard evidence. No need for witnesses who actually saw something. Just a whisper, a bit of gossip, or a nasty accusation from a jealous neighbor was often enough to have you dragged before a magistrate. In many ancient and medieval societies, the line between personal grudges and legal action was incredibly blurry. If someone with more influence than you wanted you out of the way, they could simply start a rumor that you were a witch, a traitor, or a heretic. And just like that, you are in serious trouble. Today, we talk about being innocent until proven guilty. But for centuries, it was the other way around. If you were accused, you were often presumed guilty, and the burden was on you to prove your innocence. And how could you do that? Sometimes, it involved bizarre and dangerous methods known as trial by ordeal. For example, you might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar. If your hand healed cleanly within a few days, it was seen as a sign from God that you were innocent. If it got infected, well, you were guilty. Another common ordeal was being thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent though, unfortunately, also drowned. If you floated, you were guilty, because the pure water was seen as rejecting you. It was a no-win situation. What about getting a confession? Modern police interrogations have strict rules. But in the past, getting a confession was often the main goal, and the methods used were brutal. Torture was not just common. It was a legally sanctioned tool to extract a confession, regardless of whether the person was actually guilty. Devices designed to inflict unimaginable pain were used to break a person's spirit. Under that kind of agony, people would confess to anything just to make it stop. These forced confessions were then presented as proof of guilt, leading to imprisonment or execution. The idea that a confession obtained through torture is reliable is a surprisingly recent development in legal history. And if you happen to get on the wrong side of someone powerful, like a king, a queen, or a high-ranking noble, forget about justice. Power was the ultimate law. If a ruler decided you were a threat to their power, you could be arrested and locked away in a dungeon without any trial at all. Think of the Tower of London, filled with political prisoners who were never formally charged with a crime. They were simply enemies of the state. Executions could be swift and public, serving as a warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge authority. The concept of rule of law, where everyone, including the ruler, is subject to the law, just didn't exist. The monarch's word was final. So, when we look at our modern courtrooms, with their complex rules of evidence, trained lawyers arguing both sides, and a jury of our peers, it's not just a boring legal process. It's the result of centuries of struggle, reform, and a complete revolution in how we think about fairness and truth. The idea that every person deserves a defense, that evidence must be proven, and that torture is barbaric is a precious achievement. It's a system built to protect the innocent from rumors, power plays, and forced confessions. It's not perfect, but compared to where throughout history, when it came to the ultimate punishment, not all methods were created equal. For the common criminal, a grim variety of fates awaited. But for nobles, knights, and even royalty who fell from grace, one method stood out as the so-called privilege of their class. Beheading. It was seen as a quicker, more dignified end compared to the prolonged agonies reserved for others. But was it really? Let's pull back the curtain on this iconic and often misunderstood form of execution. Picture a somber morning. A scaffold has been erected in a public square or a private castle courtyard. A crowd is gathered, their mood a mix of morbid curiosity, solemnity, and sometimes outright celebration. The prisoner, often a well-known figure, is led to the platform. There's no hanging, no drawn-out spectacle, just a simple wooden block and a man standing by with a weapon. This man is the executioner, and the success of this entire grim proceeding rests squarely on his shoulders. The weapon of choice varied. In England, the heavy, brutal-looking executioner's axe was common. Across the Channel in France and Germany, the long, two-handed executioner's sword was often preferred, a specialized tool with no point, designed for a single, powerful, slicing motion. The idea of an honorable death was central to why beheading was chosen for the elite. It was about preserving a sliver of dignity in the face of ultimate disgrace. A death by the sword or axe was associated with the battlefield, a warrior's end, even if it was being delivered by a stat-appointed official. It was a swift transaction, intended to be over in a single moment, unlike the slow suffocation of the gallows. For the family of the condemned, this quick end also meant the body was largely intact, allowing for a proper burial, a final comfort denied to many others whose bodies were left to public display. This distinction was incredibly important in a society so deeply structured by class and honor. The way you died was the final statement on who you were in life. But here's the chilling reality. The honor of beheading was a gamble, entirely dependent on the executioner's skill. A master executioner was a respected, if feared, professional. They knew their anatomy, their weapon, and how to deliver a clean, single strike that severed the head in one go. This was the best-case scenario, the one every prisoner prayed for. The crowd would witness a swift, efficient act of justice. However, executioners were human, and mistakes were terrifyingly common. An inexperienced or nervous executioner, a poorly sharpened blade, or even a prisoner who flinched at the last second could lead to a horrific botch. Imagine the sheer terror. The blade falls, but instead of a clean cut, it hits the shoulder or the back of the skull. The prisoner is not dead, but horrifically wounded and in agony. The executioner must strike again, and sometimes again and again. There are documented accounts of multiple blows needed to finish the job, turning a supposedly dignified end into a bloody, gruesome spectacle of incompetence and suffering. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a famous example. It reportedly took 3 strikes with an axe to remove her head. These botched executions shattered the illusion of a noble death, exposing it as the brutal, violent act it truly was. The crowd's silent respect could instantly turn to gasps of horror and outrage. So, while beheading was framed as a privilege for the powerful, it was a far cry from a peaceful passing. It was a public performance, with a final act hinged on the unsteady hand of one man. The line between a swift, honorable death and a prolonged, agonizing butchery was terrifyingly thin. It is a stark reminder that even when trying to codify death with rules of class and honor, the reality was often just as brutal for the king. Have you ever wondered about the darker side of history? Specifically how societies dealt with crime? Today, we're diving into the history of one of the most infamous methods of execution: hanging. It's a somber topic, but understanding it gives us a unique window into the past, into justice, society, and even human nature itself. Let's set the scene. Imagine a bustling town square, centuries ago. Markets are active, people are going about their day, but there's a palpable tension in the air. In the center stands a wooden structure, a scaffold, with a single rope dangling ominously. This was the stage for public executions, and hanging was the most common spectacle. Interestingly, the method of execution often depended on your social status. While nobles might be granted a swifter end, perhaps by beheading, hanging was typically reserved for the common folk. It was a punishment for a wide range of crimes, from theft to murder. The message was clear. This was the ultimate price for breaking the law, and it was meant to be seen by everyone. The process itself was grimly methodical. The condemned person would be led up onto a raised platform. A heavy rope, often thick and coarse, would be placed around their neck, the knot positioned in a specific way. The crowd would fall silent. Then, with a sudden jolt, the platform or the cart they stood on would be pulled away. The person would drop, and the force of the fall was intended to bring about a quick end. However, this wasn't always the case. Early forms of hanging were often slow and agonizing. The drop might not be long enough to cause an instant, humane death. Instead, it became a slow process of strangulation. This aspect made the punishment even more terrifying to the public, which was precisely the point. It was designed to be a deterrent, a brutal public lesson to anyone who might consider a life of crime. The sight of a body dangling for hours, or even days, was a stark and constant reminder of the consequences. Now, let's talk about the crowd. Public hangings were major events. People would travel from surrounding villages to witness them. For some, it was a somber, religious occasion. They would gather to pray for the soul of the condemned, reflecting on morality and mortality. They saw it as a necessary, albeit tragic, part of maintaining social order. But for many others, it was a form of morbid entertainment. It was a day out, a break from the monotony of daily life. Vendors would sell food and drinks, and the atmosphere could sometimes feel like a festival. People would jostle for the best view, and the executioner could even become a minor celebrity. This duality is fascinating. On one hand, it was a solemn act of state-sanctioned justice. On the other, it was a public spectacle that drew in the curious and the thrill-seekers alike. This practice of public execution continued for centuries, but attitudes slowly began to change. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human rights and the nature of punishment. Reformers started to question the morality and effectiveness of these brutal public displays. Was it truly a deterrent, or was it just desensitizing people to violence? Was it justice, or was it just a cruel show? As these ideas gained traction, the practice of public hanging began to decline. Executions were moved behind the high walls of prisons, away from the public eye. The focus shifted from public spectacle to a more private state-administered procedure. The development of the long drop method, calculated to cause a quick and certain death by breaking the neck, was also a move toward a more humane form of execution, if such a term can even be used. Looking back, the history of hanging tells us so much about the evolution of our legal systems and our collective sense of morality. It's a powerful reminder of how societies have grappled with the concepts of crime, punishment, and human dignity. What was once considered a necessary tool for maintaining order is now viewed by many as a relic of a more brutal past. It forces us to ask ourselves important questions. What is the purpose of punishment? Is it retribution, deterrence, or rehabilitation? How does a society balance justice with compassion? These are not easy questions, and every generation has had to find its own answers. Thank you for joining me on this journey into a difficult but important. Have you ever wondered about the darkest chapters of human history? What drove people to commit unimaginable acts of cruelty in the name of faith and order? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most terrifying forms of punishment ever devised. Death by burning. It's a chilling story, but understanding it helps us grasp the immense power of fear and belief throughout history. So, why burning? Why this specific, horrifying method? For the authorities of the past, particularly during periods of intense religious upheaval like the Inquisition, burning wasn't just about ending a life. It was a deeply symbolic act. They believed fire had a purifying quality, that it could literally cleanse the soul of the condemned, especially those accused of heresy, the ultimate religious crime. To challenge the established church was seen as a spiritual sickness, and fire was the supposed cure. But this cleansing was, in reality, a brutal instrument of control, designed to inflict maximum suffering and send a terrifying message to anyone who dared to question authority. Let's walk through the grim procedure. The process was a public spectacle, a piece of theater designed for mass intimidation. Imagine a town square, bustling with people, a mix of the curious, the devout, and the fearful. In the center, a large wooden post, or stake, was erected. The condemned person, often weakened from imprisonment and interrogation, would be brought out and tied securely to this post. Then, bundles of wood, called faggots, along with straw and other flammable materials, would be piled high around their feet and legs. Sometimes, for a quicker end, some might say, more merciful, a bag of gunpowder was hung around the prisoner's neck. But this was not always the case. The moment the fire was lit was the climax of the spectacle. The flames would slowly lick at the wood, the smoke billowing up before the fire truly took hold. The suffering was unimaginable. It was a slow, agonizing death. The public nature of these events was crucial. It wasn't just a punishment for one person. It was a warning to everyone watching. The message was crystal clear. This is what happens when you stray from the path. This is the price of dissent. The goal was to instill a deep-seated fear that would ensure compliance and silence any opposition before it even began. The psychological impact of this practice was profound. It created a society where people were afraid to speak their minds, to discuss new ideas, or even to read certain books. Neighbors might suspect neighbors. A careless word could lead to an accusation, and an accusation could easily lead to the stake. This atmosphere of terror forced countless individuals to live a double life, practicing their true beliefs in secret while outwardly conforming to the state-enforced religion. Scholars, reformers, and ordinary people who simply had a different interpretation of their faith were all at risk. This fear stifled intellectual progress and reinforced the power of the institutions that wielded the threat of the flames. Looking back, we see burning not as a tool of spiritual purification, but as a weapon of psychological warfare. It highlights a time when belief was so intertwined with power that difference of opinion was considered a capital crime. The smoke from those pyres has long since cleared, but the memory serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of intolerance and the horrific consequences of using fear to control belief. It's a somber lesson from our past that we must never forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey into a darker side of history. It's important to confront these truths to better understand. Ever wondered what the worst punishment in history was? Well, England had a contender that was so brutal, it makes you shiver just thinking about it. It was reserved for the most heinous crime in the eyes of the crown: high treason. This wasn't just about ending a life. It was about making a terrifying public spectacle. The goal: to scare everyone into absolute loyalty. This punishment was known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a gruesome, multi-stage process designed for maximum suffering and humiliation. Imagine this. You've been accused of betraying the king. Your trial is swift. The verdict is guilty. But your sentence isn't a quick execution. No, that would be too merciful. Instead, your ordeal is just beginning, and it's going to be very, very public. The first part of the punishment was the drawing. You'd be tied to a wooden panel, or sometimes just roped by your ankles, and dragged by a horse through the filthy, crowded streets of the city. This wasn't a gentle ride. You'd be bounced over cobblestones, through mud and waste, all while the public jeered and threw things at you. The journey from your prison, or from the Tower of London, to the place of execution could be miles long. This agonizing procession served a clear purpose. It was a parade of shame, stripping you of all dignity before you even reached the gallows. It was a clear message from the state. This is what happens to our enemies. We control your body, your reputation, and your final moments. Once you arrived at the execution site, battered and broken, the next stage began. The hanging. But this wasn't a modern hanging designed for a quick death by a broken neck. The idea was to hang you until you were just on the brink of death, but not actually dead. You would be hoisted up, choking and struggling, for everyone to see. The executioner had to be skilled, timing it perfectly to cut you down while you were still conscious. The crowd would watch, captivated by the horror. This deliberate act of near asphyxiation was crucial for the next, most gruesome part of the punishment. The sheer terror you would feel, gasping for air, only to be brought back down for more, is almost unimaginable. And now for the part that truly defined this punishment's brutality. The drawing and quartering. While you were still alive and conscious, you would be laid out on a block. The executioner would then take a knife and disembowel you. Your intestines and other organs would be pulled out and often burned in a fire right in front of your eyes. The law specifically stated that the traitor should see their own entrails burn. It was the ultimate act of degradation, a visceral display of the state's power to literally tear you apart. The psychological torment of this moment is something we can barely comprehend today. It was a slow, agonizing, and deeply personal violation, all performed for a cheering or horrified audience. But it wasn't over yet. After you finally died from the shock and blood loss, the final act of quartering took place. Your lifeless body would be beheaded, and then your torso would be chopped into 4 separate pieces. This completed the quartering. These parts weren't given a respectful burial. Instead, they were treated as trophies of the state's victory over treason. The head was often stuck on a pike and displayed at a prominent location, like London Bridge, as a constant rotting warning to anyone who might consider betraying the crown. The 4 quarters of the body were sent to different cities across the kingdom to be put on public display. This ensured the traitor's shame and the king's power were broadcast far and wide. It was a complete annihilation of the person, denying them not only a peaceful death, but also a proper burial and a place of rest. From the first drag through the streets to the final display of dismembered limbs, this punishment was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was a clear and terrifying statement. Betray the crown and the state. Ever wondered what it took to get a confession in the old days? It wasn't always about clever questioning. Imagine this. You're accused of a crime, but you refuse to plead guilty or not guilty. You choose to remain silent. What happens next is something straight out of a nightmare. They take you to a dark room, lay you on the ground, and place a heavy wooden board on your chest. Then, slowly, they start adding weights. Stone after stone. The pressure builds, crushing you, making it impossible to breathe. This brutal practice was known as pena forte et dure, which means strong and hard punishment in French. It was a terrifying method used in England and colonial America, not to punish a crime, but to force a plea. The law at the time could unproceed with a trial unless the accused entered a plea of guilty or not guilty. Silence completely stalled the justice system. So, they devised this horrifying ordeal to break a person's silence. The choice was agonizing. Confess, possibly to a crime you didn't commit, and face the consequences, or endure the crushing weight until you either gave in or your body gave out. It was a choice between a quick death by hanging, if you confessed to a capital crime, or a slow, excruciating death under the stones. Why would anyone choose the stones? Well, there was a strange but significant loophole. If you died without confessing, you were never convicted. This meant your property and lands wouldn't be seized by the state. They would pass on to your family, your heirs. For many, this was a final act of defiance and provision for their loved ones. They chose to be crushed to death to protect their family's future. One of the most famous cases is that of Giles Corey during the Salem witch trials in 1692. An elderly farmer, Corey refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. He knew the court was hysterical and a fair trial was impossible, so he chose silence. For 2 days, they piled stones on his chest. Witnesses said his only words, when asked to confess, were more weight. He died under the immense pressure, but he died unconvicted, and his farm passed to his son. His story became a symbol of stubborn integrity against a corrupt system. This bizarre and cruel practice highlights a fascinating shift in our understanding of justice. Back then, a confession was seen as the ultimate proof of guilt, the gold standard. The system was obsessed with getting that plea, even if it meant using extreme torture. The truth of whether the person actually committed the crime often seemed secondary. It was more about following legal procedure, no matter how barbaric. They valued the confession itself more than the facts of the case. Today, we look back in horror. Our modern legal systems are built on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the accused to confess. We have rights against self-incrimination, the right to remain silent without being tortured for it. The story of Pin Forte et Dure serves as a chilling reminder of how far our justice systems have come, and why protecting the rights of the accused is so fundamentally important. It shows us a time when silence was a capital offense, and the weight of the law was all. Throughout history, we often imagine executions as dramatic, public events. A guillotine's fall, a hangman's noose, a firing squad's volley. These images are shocking, designed to be swift and serve as a public warning. But what if I told you about a form of execution that was silent, slow, and happened far from the public eye? A method that was just as deliberate, but infinitely more cruel, unfolding over months or even years within the cold, dark confines of a prison cell. This wasn't about a quick end. It was about a gradual, agonizing process of being erased from the world. Imagine being thrown into a bare, stone cell. There's no proper bed, just a thin mat on a damp floor. The air is frigid, seeping into your bones day and night. Darkness is your constant companion, broken only by a sliver of light from a high, barred window if you're lucky. The silence is profound, punctuated only by the drip of water, the scuttling of rats, or the distant, muffled sounds of a world you're no longer part of. This profound isolation was a weapon in itself. Humans are social creatures. We need interaction, conversation, and connection to stay mentally healthy. When you strip that away, the mind begins to unravel. Prisoners would talk to themselves, create imaginary friends, or simply stare at a wall for hours, losing all track of time. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The lack of mental stimulation, combined with constant fear and despair, was a form of psychological torment designed to break a person's spirit long before their body gave out. Then there was the physical decline. The food provided, if you could even call it that, was barely enough to sustain life. A hunk of stale bread, a bowl of thin, watery soup. It was a calculated starvation. The body, deprived of essential nutrients, begins to consume itself. Muscles waste away, making even simple movements an exhausting effort. The immune system collapses, leaving the prisoner vulnerable to diseases that would run rampant in such unsanitary conditions. A common cold could easily become pneumonia. A small cut could lead to a fatal infection. Medical care was non-existent. The guards weren't there to help. They were there to ensure you didn't escape your slow demise. Pleading for a doctor, for medicine, for a bit of warmth, all fell on deaf ears. The architects of this system understood that a sick, weakened prisoner is a compliant one. They are too frail to resist, too tired to even dream of escape. Their world shrinks to the four walls of their cell and the gnawing ache in their stomach. This method of execution by neglect was insidious because it was easily deniable. To the outside world, the authorities could claim the prisoner died of natural causes or illness. There was no public spectacle, no bloody scene to incite outrage or sympathy. It was a clean, bureaucratic way to eliminate an enemy of the state. The prisoner simply disappeared. They faded away, their suffering hidden behind thick stone walls and a facade of official procedure. Death, when it finally came, was often quiet, a final, shallow breath. In the dead of night, the prisoner might succumb to starvation, disease, or simply the sheer exhaustion of their body and mind giving up the fight. They would die alone, in the dark, their passing unnoticed, until a guard found them the next morning. For the victim, it was a prolonged nightmare. For the executioner, It was just another file closed, another problem solved without any messy public involvement. This slow, torturous method reveals a chilling aspect of human cruelty. It's a reminder that the most terrifying punishments aren't always the most violent or dramatic. Sometimes, the greatest suffering is inflicted quietly, through the deliberate and systematic withdrawal of everything that makes life worth living: food, warmth, light, and human connection. It's a dark chapter in the history of justice, one that reminds us of the terrible cost of indifference and the silent horrors that can unfold when no one is watching. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next video. Ever wondered what happened after a public execution in the past? It wasn't always a quick burial. In many societies, the punishment didn't end with death. Instead, it became a gruesome, public spectacle. Let's delve into the dark history of why heads were placed on spikes. Imagine walking into a medieval city. You look up at the main gate, the grand entrance to your home, and there, staring down at you, are the decaying heads of executed criminals. This wasn't a scene from a fantasy movie. It was a grim reality. Major bridges, like London Bridge, became infamous galleries of the dead. These heads, often dipped in tar to slow down decomposition, were a constant, silent message from the authorities. But why go to such lengths? The primary reason was deterrence. It was a brutal, in-your-face warning to anyone even thinking about breaking the law. Seeing the fate of traitors, rebels, or even common criminals was meant to instill a deep-seated fear. It told the public, this is what happens when you cross us. It wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was about controlling the entire population through terror. Every person who passed by, from a merchant to a child, received the same chilling reminder of the state's absolute power. This practice also served as a form of posthumous humiliation. In an era where a proper burial was seen as crucial for the afterlife, denying it was the ultimate dishonor. By displaying a head, the authorities were essentially erasing the person's identity and legacy, reducing them to a mere object of public scorn. Their family would have to endure the shame of seeing their loved one as remains treated with such contempt. It was a powerful psychological tool, ensuring that the punishment extended beyond the physical body to the very memory of the condemned. So who were these unfortunate souls? They ranged from high-profile political figures to common thieves. Perhaps the most famous example is William Wallace, the Scottish hero, whose head was placed on London Bridge after his execution. Oliver Cromwell, despite dying of natural causes, had his body exhumed years later. His head was then stuck on a spike above Westminster Hall for over 2 decades. This shows how far rulers would go to make a point, even against a long-dead enemy. These displays weren't just for rebels. Pirates, forgers, and murderers could all meet the same end. The decline of this practice was gradual. As societies moved into the Age of Enlightenment, ideas about justice and human dignity began to change. The public's appetite for such gruesome displays waned, and the practice came to be seen as barbaric and uncivilized. The last heads were taken down from London's gates in the late 18th century, marking the end of a long and brutal chapter in the history of punishment. This practice serves as a stark reminder of how methods of control and justice have evolved. It shows a time when fear was the main currency of power, and public space was used to broadcast the state's authority in the most visceral way possible. What was once a daily sight is now a chilling story from our collective past, a testament to how much our world has changed. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into a darker side of history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the past. See you next time.